So we're just gonna roll with it here. Thank you all for joining us for the Future of Female Sports World Rugby. I'm excited to bring you the speakers that we have on board tonight, and just to give you a little bit about myself, Beth Stelzer, founder of Save Women's Sports. I'm an amateur powerlifter, and I happened upon this journey during my first powerlifting competition, the Women's State Championship, where a male decided to protest because he wasn't allowed to enter. Kind of fell down the rabbit hole after that, and here we are, about a year and a half after I just started a website. We're international, and we're making laws and legislation that matter. Thank you all for joining me. And it looks like we're having a little difficulty with Emma Hilton. So we are going to head right into our first introduction here. Linda Blade, Twitter warrior, Canadian. Heck, I'm just gonna let you roll with your title, okay?
Thank you, Beth. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Greetings from Edmonton, Alberta in Canada. As of yesterday, I've been renewed as president of track and field in Alberta, Athletics Alberta. So I have another
congratulations.
Thank you. I have another 2-year term. So that helps
me. Cool.
Yep. I'm going to stay
for females in Canada.
Well, we actually are working hard at that with our policy, and also just trying to, you know, make the sport progress. But my background is I actually benefited from Title IX in the States. I was on an NCAA scholarship whilst in university back in the 80s in heptathlon. And that's like the decathlon, but for women. And I actually found Beth through Fair Play for Women. Beth was on that group with me, and then all of a sudden I noticed somebody started this thing in the US called Save Women's Sports. Who could that be? Well, that was Beth. And I knew that she struck gold with that, because in a way it's like somebody in the United States had to start this, because we all know that what happens in the United States is probably the most influential in terms of this issue. If we could make a lot of progress there. I know the women in our sisters in the UK, and all of our people, even the gentlemen in the UK who are fighting for us, they've been doing a good job, and they're way ahead of us. But the USA is the gorilla in the room. And if we could get Beth and her colleagues to move forward, well, anyway, I was very honored to be encouraging Beth to continue on with Save Women's Sports and to develop that. And she's done an amazing job. So thank you, Beth, for all you have done. And I guess the reason I'm passionate about this is just, I really honestly believe this is our last stand. If we don't push back, this is the hill we all die on. There will be no women's sport. So my whole life has been about women's sport, about sports. I mean, I coach athletes, male and female, in 17 different sports. But you know, seriously, it's going to be a big change for women if we don't push back on this issue. And so I'm going to put it back to you, Beth. Let's get started with this amazing seminar. And I look forward to hearing what everybody has to say. Thank you, everybody.
Me too. So I apologize if we end up having any technical difficulties here with our first go round. Looks like we are having a little bit with Emma. Hopefully she'll be able to join us. But in the meantime, we have the fabulous Rowena Edge. Can you introduce yourself to us, please?
Thank you, Beth. So yes, I'm Row Edge. I'm from New Zealand, where we have a weightlifter called Laurel Hubbard, who you may all be aware of. Laurel appeared in the 2018 Commonwealth Games, so that really raised the issue of trans women competing in women's sport over here. So I'm part of a group called Speak Up for Women here in New Zealand, and we exist to protect and advance the rights of women and girls in New Zealand. And earlier this year, we set up a group called Save Women's Sport New Zealand, so we could better focus on the growing issue of trans women participation in women's sports. So I lead that group. I've got a daughter who's on a US college scholarship, a sporting scholarship, and a niece who's in the New Zealand cycling team, and fingers crossed is going to the Tokyo Olympics, if they ever happen. So it's a topic pretty close to my heart. So this year we set up a website, savewomensport.co.nz. You can also link to that through savewomensport.com, and that focuses on the issue from a New Zealand perspective, but it also links to Beth's amazing petition. So if you haven't, that's to, for the IOC to suspend those 2015 transgender guidelines. So if you haven't already signed that petition, please do. You'll be able to find the link via our website or via Beth's. So as part of our campaign, we contacted a whole lot of retired elite New Zealand athletes. We decided we didn't want to put any existing elite athletes in a situation where their position could be threatened due to supporting our cause. So we got in touch with as many elite New Zealand athletes that are retired as possible. One that came forward pretty much straight away was a lady called Barbara Kendall. I don't know if any of you have heard about her, but she's one of New Zealand's most amazing performing female athletes ever. So Barbara attended 5 Olympic Games. She's won bronze, silver and gold medals in the board sailing, but she also happens to be on the IOC committee. So she has been an incredible advocate for us. She understands our concerns. She shared with us an acknowledgement from the IOC that they know they need to better balance fairness and non-discrimination and inclusion, and has let us know the process they've been going through. So they've had a high-powered team working on this with the objective of developing voluntary guidelines for international federations and then having those subject to periodic reviews as well. Apparently they're yet to finish their research, but they can't be too far off. But we understand from Barbara, the one thing they have expressed is a desire to remove the requirement for trans and DSD, that's athletes who have a difference of sexual development. They were called intersex, but DST is kind of the new terminology they like to use. They want to remove the requirement for them to undergo medically unnecessary surgeries or treatment. Now, what's interesting is this might be at odds now with World Athletics policy, which has just been upheld by the Swiss Federal Supreme Court. I don't know if any of you have been following the Caster Semenya case. And so that states now that even DSD athletes must reduce their testosterone to less than 5 nanomoles per milliliter in order to compete. So many believe that maybe the IOC has been waiting for the Swiss Federal Court's decision before announcing their revised policy. We're not sure. It'll be interesting to see if there's any movement with that in the next wee while, but Barbara personally believes that this will come to a consensus next year, at least, probably not this year, but definitely next year. So we just hope it's in time for the Olympics, fingers crossed. Barbara also really kindly presented a letter from us to the IOC's July meeting, which was huge. So in that we expressed how we believe that elite sport should always be the pinnacle for the very best of athletes, and by creating that pathway for biological male athletes to be able to excel at the top level in place of females, the Olympics actually lose the very essence of what they're all about. And we expressed too how wrong it is and unfair that a personal decision of a biological male to self-ID as a woman actually enhances their chances of success while costing women and girls their representative and podium positions, especially when there's no exclusion for them from the male division at the moment. So Barbara believes the IOC are hearing our voices, but they've also got a number of other really crunchy issues they've got to deal with right now. You know, for instance, will Tokyo even go ahead because of COVID? And if it doesn't, what are the ramifications and ripple effect on sports worldwide? And also this year, because there's limited sporting events happening, there's no regular drug testing happening. So how are they going to ensure that if the Tokyo Olympics do go ahead, that they'll actually be a clean Olympics as well? So, you know, they've got a lot to contend with right now. And part of me wonders actually if they might be waiting for the decision by World Rugby in regards to their trans eligibility policy too. So I'd like to just briefly talk about where New Zealand rugby is. We like to think we're a pretty passionate rugby nation here in New Zealand. I don't know if you've heard of our All Blacks or our Black Ferns. We think they're the best rugby teams in the world, and men's and women's teams. And you know, women's rugby has undergone phenomenal growth in New Zealand and I think globally as well. It accounts for more than a quarter of all the total players globally now, which is huge. A big focus that World Rugby have had for quite some time now, at least 5, maybe even 10 years, has been on player welfare. Obviously, it's a contact sport. I don't know how many of you have ever watched a rugby game. It's a little bit different to what you have over in the States. Like, it's pretty hardcore. So it's really, really important that they look after the health and safety of their players and mitigate injuries as much as possible, especially neck injuries and concussion, because they tend to be the 2 prominent ones that are known with rugby. So that rugby desperately want to be inclusive, you know, but where that inclusiveness creates potential issues for fairness and safety, then they have a problem. And based on all the published evidence to date, allowing biological males to compete against females creates that increased safety risk. And we've seen evidence over in the UK of female referees quitting because, you know, they'll turn up to a club game to ref, and when there's a trans woman on the field, they don't believe they can adequately protect the female players on there. So yeah, just that increased risk of injury when you've got typical male-bodied players competing against female players in tackles is just too great. So we've been dealing here in New Zealand with the New Zealand Rugby Union. We've been having really good, robust conversations with them, and had a really good chat last week with the executive member who's actually leading up this process for them. He admitted they've got people on both sides of the debate, the health and safety and the human rights. They feel the process that World Rugby are going through in terms of consulting with the unions around the world is too quick, and they haven't got time to go through an adequate process themselves. So what they're doing at this stage is they're summarising all the points of view that they've heard, and there's obviously been quite a lot of aggressive points of view from trans activists, but they're presenting that to their executive team this week, and then they'll take it to a subcommittee of the New Zealand Rugby Union board next week with the intention of getting back to World Rugby with their decision by about the 30th of September. My gut feel from talking to them is that they'll tell World Rugby they don't think they should make a decision in November, that more research and consultation should be undertaken. I guess my counter to that is that the longer they leave it, the more risk of injury there is to our female players. So why not protect the players in the interim and then do that additional research? So the positive we have here in New Zealand is that they're definitely considering the biology and health and safety aspect because they've got a chief science advisor working on it. So that's really positive. They're also going to work with Sport New Zealand, which is an overarching sporting body in New Zealand, to run an independent process around consulting more broadly with the community, and they've promised that will be a part of that consultation. And it will be interesting to see if that Sport New Zealand work flows over to other sports here in New Zealand too. So yeah, so things are progressing. We have to keep our fingers crossed that New Zealand Rugby Union makes the right decision for its female players. But you know, one thing I'd like to say is I honestly believe this has only become the complex problem that it is, and it is my personal belief, because men have just never been accepting of the diversity of their sex. I mean, look how long it took for them to accept homosexuality. And if they had been accepting, then maybe trans women would have felt comfortable playing in the men's teams, and this wouldn't have been made a woman's problem. So anyway, so fingers crossed the IOC, World Rugby, New Zealand Rugby. I know Canada Rugby has made a really unfortunate decision, but yeah, let's hope everybody else comes out on the right side of this. And I think it's really important for everybody, if you have any contacts with local rugby clubs, get in touch with them. Again, go to our savewomensport.co.nz or .com website or Beth's website and sign that petition as well. But Beth, thank you for giving me a voice on this too. You're an absolute legend. So you're just rocking it. Right.
We're so excited to have you tonight. Yeah, Linda, mention about what's going on in Canada in rugby.
Yeah, so apparently, as soon as the draft policy was circulated amongst the stakeholders that were at the rugby meeting in February, obviously it leaked to people outside of that basic circle, the meeting room, and lots of different entities, media outlets, and different organizations got a hold of the draft, what was going to be basically proposed. Because you have to understand that just because World Rugby, the executive branch, has come up with a list of proposals, it's still the rugby, the council, that has to vote on those regulations later in the fall. So this has kicked into the political season of everybody trying to influence the way the World Rugby Council is going to vote on the proposed, what they're calling the banning of trans women from women's sports. So keeping sports, rugby, single sex for girls, female persons only. And so Rugby Canada immediately chose to take the activist route and immediately proclaim that they're not going to follow the World Rugby policy if it excludes trans women from women's rugby. And one of the things that bothered me about that particular letter was they invoked the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is absolutely insane, because the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms says nothing about gender identity or gender expression, only says that you cannot discriminate on the basis of sex, of biological sex. And that was the original charter for Canadians for human rights. And only later, Bill C-16, which is, of course, everybody knows what Jordan Peterson was worried about. Only later in 2017 have we added to the Human Rights Code gender identity, gender expression, but that does not supersede our charter. So if people are telling us that we must include male bodies, biological males, into female sports, a lot of us can argue, and now World Rugby has come up with the data to prove it, that is literally discriminating against female athletes. So the fact that Canadian Rugby Canada would actually use the charter as somehow, invoking that as somehow justifying their resistance to World Rugby is terrible. It's false and it's silly. But that's what they've done. And I guess it makes sense, because if you look at Canada from east to west, the far western province of British Columbia, tucked up against the Pacific Ocean there, they are the most progressive, the most woke. They are the people that are always pushing this progressive agenda. And that's where Rugby Canada's headquarters are. So somebody took it upon themselves in that particular province to immediately push back against World Rugby, even before really considering all of the arguments that World Rugby is making. So it's an activist stance, and people like women like me and there's a group in Canada of women called Canadian Association for Women's for Sex, Declaration of Canadian Women for Sex-Based Rights, COSBAR. We basically collectively wrote a letter to World Rugby and said we don't agree with our own Rugby Canada position on this issue. And so please consider that there's other Canadian points of view, not just Rugby Canada. And we're really hoping that Rugby Canada still takes a step back and does another review on their position based on the fact very clearly women will be increasing their injuries by 30% if male bodies are in the sport. And it's been obviously discussed and proven to be the case. So one more thing about that. If women get injured in Canada, they could have a valid court case against Rugby Canada, because the world governing body of rugby has already proven that increases the risk. And if Canada goes ahead and allows this anyway, it opens them up to insurance claims or to claims that will probably increase, because we collectively have sport insurance in Canada. So it will collectively increase all of our premiums, I think, if rugby goes ahead and does this. So we all have a stake in them being reasonable about this and not being activists. And I'm sorry to go on about that, but that's basically kind of the Canadian perspective on it. And I believe, since Emma Hilton isn't here, Beth, I think maybe we should go with Jennifer. Could you introduce Jennifer and let her introduce herself?
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Linda. I never feel like you're rambling. We all would love to hear what you say all the time.
Well, we're concerned and we're doing our best. So take it away, Jennifer.
Get her to start her video up here.
Am I here?
She's here. All right, everyone. I would like to introduce you to Jennifer Billick, the author of the 11th Hour blog, and she can introduce herself a little bit more. She is going to let us know about the money trail of how we got to this point with World Rugby and who's funding it, and buckle your seat. Here she is.
Indeed, buckle your seats. Okay, so I'm a journalist, and as Beth mentioned, oh, by the way, I'm like really happy to be here. I was very honored that you asked me to be here. I feel like I'm amongst celebrity. But I'm a journalist, and as Beth mentioned, I write for the 11th Hour blog, my blog, which is talks about the intersection of transgenderism, capitalism, and technology. And I'm here because I believe transgender ideology is nothing short of an existential threat to women and humanity. Not hyperbole. I really, really believe this. Before looking at the intersection of transgenderism and women's sports, I'd like to just do a little backdrop of the gender identity industry. And it is an industry. Its roots in the medical industrial complex, so that we can understand the picture on the whole of what's happening here in women's sports. Transgenderism is a corporate rebranding of a male sexual fetish, transsexualism, which obsessively objectifies female biology. It was added to LGB after same-sex attraction was corporatized for profit by the medical industrial complex during the AIDS crisis. Some of the richest men in the world invested in pharma and tech advancements, created corporate identities out of sexual orientation. Transgenderism goes one better. It corporatizes and colonizes human sexual dimorphism for profit. You can follow links at my blog to all this information. Who's funding what? I just want to, talk about what it looks like, the broad picture. Our wholeness as a sexual dimorphic species is being broken into interchangeable parts for capital. There is big money in normalizing body dissociation, which is why they're driving gender ideology into grade schools. Sexual dimorphism is being broken into parts for sale. Wombs, sperm, eggs, women's penises, men's vaginas, synthetic breast milk, synthetic blood, gene manipulation, etc. There are thousands of trans organizations all across the globe that have been established with huge corporate medical and tech investments. The profit being manifested in body dissociation comes from the obvious: surgeries, hormones, pain medications, anti-rejection drugs, etc. Beyond this, there is an eye toward engineering human biology in the future toward different aims, including speculation about the possibility of womb transplants for men. The only reason corporations, banks, investment houses, governments, the UN, Amnesty International, the ACLU, along with major sports organizations right up to the Olympics, care about 0.03% of the population expressing itself is profit. Big Pharma is the largest lobbying entity in Congress and are the only entity powerful enough to create the rapid global changes we are seeing in law and language to erase women. The global healthcare industry is a $3 trillion a year enterprise. It is a system that needs sick people, or in the case of gender identity ideology, medical identities, to continue profiting. Now let's look at how trans and pharma intersect with sports. Using rugby as one sport can currently, creating contentions around the issue of men in women's sports. Ireland is the home of Irish rugby and the Irish Rugby Football Union, which allows men to play as women if they perceive themselves as female. Ireland is also home to TENE, Transgender Equality Network Ireland, which along with ILGA are two of the largest transgender organizations in Europe and Central Asia. Collectively, they represent over 800 organizations and groups across the region working to normalize body dissociation as identity and drive the idea globally that we are not a sexually dimorphic species. Ireland is a massive pharmaceutical hub. 20 years ago, it had about 50 biopharma corporations dotted throughout the country. The recent numbers put that figure at 300, 19 of 20 of the largest. Rugby is an extremely physical sport and brings a high risk of injury, which often impacts players well into retirement. Astellas Pharma US, Johnson & Johnson, and AbbVie Pharma are just a few of the pharmaceutical corporations with bases in Ireland that make drugs that cross over in the care for those injured in extreme sports and those overhauling their second sex characteristics, including antibiotics, pain treatment drugs, puberty blockers, testosterone, immunology, transplantation, and urology medicines. In 2015, Astellas Pharma signed up as the title sponsor for the rugby test match between USA and Australia, and has received, like other pharma corporations, high marks from the trans lobby for their LGBT protections and support. Though lesbian, gays, and bisexuals are not inherently medical patients. Astellas has also invested millions of dollars in regenerative cell and gene therapies. Regenerative medicine seeks to replace tissues or organs that have been damaged by disease or trauma. The tools used to realize these outcomes are tissue engineering, cellular therapies, artificial organs, and medical devices. It is not a coincidence that the founder of the largest LGBT NGO in America is heir to a multi-billion-dollar medical supply corporation, which he uses to fund his LGBT NGO. AbbVie Pharma, maker of puberty blocker Lupron, has created a unique sporting partnership with Ireland's Gaelic football team. It is the only sponsorship in Ireland between a multinational pharmaceutical company and a Gaelic football team. Like other pharma corporations serving people reconfiguring their sex characteristics, AbbVie has also found a market in the sports nutrition industry, a global market valued at $15.6 billion. It is hard to ignore the implications of these intersections and why transgenderism carries the day in the sports arena, from high school to universities and the Olympics. It is very profitable for the pharma and tech industries to embrace the newly emerging gender identity industry and leave a wasteland of women's rights to their own sports in their wake. I encourage everybody here to support the incredible work of Save Women's Sports and to sign the open letter to World Rugby. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. It was an honor. You feel like you're amongst celebrities. Thank you so much. And everybody can check out Jennifer's work at the 11thhourblog.com. Whew, well, now let's move on. Linda, would you like the honors of introducing our next guest?
Oh, Beth, you know what? I am so honored to introduce the next star of our show. And I think people have become very much aware of this person over the past while because of her tremendous speeches in the Senate of Australia. And her name is Senator Claire Chandler. She has been a rock star and a real soldier in fighting for women in sport and for women's single sex access to sport. And it just gives me thrill and a pleasure to introduce her. I'm going to let her say more about herself, but Senator Chandler, you are most welcome. Thank you for joining this meeting.
Thank you so much for having me, Linda, and thank you to Beth for organising this webinar. I'm sure participants would have found it incredibly informative up until this point, and I certainly have too. As Linda said, my name's Claire Chandler. I'm a senator for the state of Tasmania in Australia, and I serve in our national parliament as a result of that position. I took office in July 2019. I'm 30 years old, which makes me the youngest member of the federal government and also the youngest woman to represent the Liberal Party, which is a centre-right political party in Australia in our national parliament, which is a pretty big honour, I must say. The issue of women's sport first came to my attention right after I started my term as a senator in July last year. And it was following the publication of a set of trans inclusion guidelines by Sport Australia, which is our nation's peak sporting body. And I was contacted by hundreds of people from across the country who were concerned about the erosion of women's rights in the name of transgender inclusion as a result of what these guidelines were proposing, which was effectively that trans inclusion should be prioritised above women's sport, the issue that we've seen time and time again and that has precipitated this webinar today. So these people from across the country, mums, dads, males, females, were raising the concerns that you would expect, that fundamentally if we don't preserve women's sport to be for biological women, then we're creating both an unfair and an unsafe playing field for women to compete on. And they were quite upset that the peak sporting organisation in our country had set that precedent. So I guess as a young woman in our nation's parliament, I realised how important this issue was going to be. I have spoken many times before in my career before I was a senator about the importance of free speech and the importance for us to be able to have open and robust conversations about issues. And I think that this is one of those issues that we should be able to discuss freely, and we should be able to have an open conversation without fear of being held down by those who might disagree with us. And I'll come to that in a moment. But I also went to a single-sex girls' school growing up. And so I think that influenced me insofar as I've always understood the importance of young women, or women generally, but particularly young women, having a space available to them to grow and to develop their sense of who they are in the world. That's what I had out of my girls' school experience, and I think it's important that girls and women have that generally. So I was pretty concerned by what these everyday Australians were saying to me about the inclusion guidelines. So I took the opportunity, the privilege that I have as a senator, to be able to ask questions to Sport Australia at Senate estimates in February this year. This is a process by which all of the government officials come to our parliament in Canberra, and we as senators ask them questions about the work that they're doing, how they're spending taxpayers' money. And so I decided to ask Sport Australia a few questions about the guidelines, particularly how they'd been developed, who they'd consulted with to come to the conclusion that it was more important to prioritise the inclusion of transgender people in sport over women. And the recording of that Senate estimates questioning is available on my YouTube channel, and I would urge anyone that is interested in this issue, particularly from an Australian perspective, to have a watch of that, because it's quite telling. But in that line of questioning, Sport Australia confirmed that they didn't have a definition of the word woman that guided their women's sport policies. That they refused to provide me with information as to who they'd consulted with on the guidelines. They were very dismissive of my questions, which I think is indicative of how we ended up in this situation. Because the responses from Sport Australia were so evasive, it picked up a little bit of national media attention at the time. So I was able to start advocating on this issue more publicly. But then, of course, COVID-19 happened, and that put a little bit of a dampener on our ability to advocate for this. Where our parliament wasn't sitting, everyone was talking about COVID-19, so it was a little bit difficult to get traction. Fast forward from February to June this year, and as everyone would be aware, the comments from J.K. Rowling around women's sex-based rights brought this issue back to the fore. And I gave a speech to the Senate in June in support of her comments and in support of sex-based rights for women. And that received quite a lot of media attention, partly because of the fact that I was standing in support with J.K. Rowling, and also the fact that World Rugby had just released its research. So that was the main impetus for me to start building a profile around the issue. Since then, I've been reported in national and local media across all platforms, print, radio, TV, online, talking about women's sex-based rights, women's sport generally, and of course the issue that we now have with World Rugby releasing its research, which I've been able to very nicely contrast with the work that Sport Australia undertook in this area. I mean, you look at what World Rugby did. They went to the biologists, the scientists, the physicians. They got the scientific evidence that supports that there is a significant safety risk to women if they're tackled by trans women on the rugby field, that there is a significant disparity in strength. All of the things that we all take to be common sense. On the other side, I can't find out from Sport Australia whether or not they consulted with scientists around these trans inclusion guidelines, because they won't tell me. But I do suspect the fact that they won't tell me probably answers the question for me. In terms of context around rugby in Australia, we are a rugby playing nation. We play both union and rugby league. And then, of course, we also have a code of ball sports called the Australian Football League, which is not the same as rugby, but is another contact sport. So I certainly see the World Rugby guidelines and the ability of Rugby Australia to adopt them as a really important step in us being able to start chipping away at the other contact sports, at least in Australia, to try and get them to see the impact that this issue is having on women's sport. Also, around the time that I started receiving a little more media attention around this issue, I was engaging with all of these international groups that are advocating for women's sport, such as Beth with Save Women's Sport in the US. I also spoke with Nicola from Fair Play for Women in the UK, and of course Ro and Speak Up for Women in New Zealand. And I found this really valuable, just in terms of understanding how the conflation of sex and gender has occurred in lots of different jurisdictions within our sporting and governmental institutions. And particularly since the World Rugby research is released, it's been useful to have contacts in other rugby playing jurisdictions to share knowledge, to understand how the consultation process is progressing. In terms of Rugby Australia, I've written to them urging them to adopt the World Rugby guidelines. I received a relatively concise response from them, basically saying thank you for your feedback. Since then, I've requested that they brief me following the decision that they make. I haven't had a response on that one yet, but I will certainly be keeping the pressure on Rugby Australia to do the right thing here. All of this being said, my advocacy was tracking very well. I was getting a fantastic following and feeling really well supported across the country, constituents contacting me in my local community. And then Thursday before last, when I was finishing up my week sitting in the Senate up in Canberra, I received a letter from the Tasmanian Anti-Discrimination Commissioner. And I have spoken about this on my Facebook page, and I would urge anyone interested, like I say, to have a look at that video. It's reached something ridiculous like 300,000 people, which is absolutely crazy. But in the letter, I found out that a complaint has been made against me by a member of the Tasmanian community based on my advocacy regarding women's rights. The complaint specifically relates to an op-ed that I wrote in my local newspaper. Ironically, the op-ed was about free speech and the importance of us being able to freely discuss these issues without fear of being shut down, and also some email correspondence that I had with that constituent when they contacted me to clarify some of my views. I've been told as a result of this complaint that I have to attend conciliation hearing next month. And I guess this complaint has really amplified the free speech element of this issue for me. Like I said, I've always cared deeply about free speech. I've always believed that our ability to progress as a democracy is contingent on our freedoms to be able to discuss issues without, like I say, being scared that you're going to be shouted down or cancelled or whatever that might be. But I think it's very troubling for free speech and women's rights if a person can't even advocate for fairness and safety in women's sport without being dragged before a discrimination commission. So honestly, it's only human, I think, that you feel a little bit average when you're served with legal action, but the national news coverage, particularly of the complaint, has brought this issue of women's sport generally to the forefront, and I'm certainly using it as an opportunity to raise the profile of this issue even further, which I think is really important and hopefully a useful way in which I can contribute to this debate a little bit further. I would really appreciate it if anyone is interested in what I'm saying on the call, if you like my Facebook page to keep up to date with everything that's happening, and you can also subscribe to my newsletter, which is the main way that I communicate with my supporters to be able to keep them up to date on this issue. But in terms of supporting women's sport more generally, if there are any Australians on the call, I would certainly urge them to contact their local members of parliament, both at the state and federal level, so that they know that this is a concern. I have been having many conversations with colleagues at both the state and federal level of government in Australia, and it's difficult at the moment with COVID-19. This is understandably an issue that's taking up a lot of people's brain space, but I think we can certainly walk and chew gum, and I do worry that if we just let COVID-19 be the cover, we're going to lose traction on these issues because, you know, we're going to see situations where things like the World Rugby guidelines will be rejected because people just think it's easier to concentrate on other issues at that time. I would certainly also urge everyone to sign the open letter to World Rugby. This is, like I say, and I think Ro alluded to this earlier, this is absolutely the first and a really important battle, I think, for us to make sure that we can preserve the notion that women's sport is for biological women and ensure that women's sex-based rights are not continually eroded. But thanks so much again, Beth, for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be on the call today, and wonderful to be connected with so many people across the world who've been so supportive of me during this, this last few months.
Well, we have your back, Claire. Thank you so much. Why don't we start out with a little Q&A here? We've got several questions. Thanks to our lovely attendees for participating in the chat and the Q&A. One thing that maybe I think we should address off the bat is the use of the term trans women. How do we go about this? Do we call them just males? I know sometimes people feel that hurts their feelings, but I think there's a conflation, and sometimes people get confused when we use the term trans women of what they really are. And I don't think most people realize these males never go through full surgery. So we're talking about people that are fully capable of abusing women. Linda, do you want to add to that?
Yes, I think I like the fair play for women approach that was suggested to me, that we should probably, and I think Kara Dansky has said this too, that we should probably say something like trans-identified males, so that we know that it's very clear to anybody listening that it's a trans person, but originally they were natal males. So TIM, trans-identified males, is probably a little bit more honest. I would say honest, because when you start throwing around trans women like I did, I shouldn't have done that, but sorry, Kara. when you start throwing around this different terminology, it gets confusing because somebody who's not up on the issue, if you say trans woman, they think it's a woman who is identifying as a male. And then if you say trans man, and then they get all confused. So I think if we were very clear, trans identified male, TIM, or trans identified female, right? And I think that way you can keep track of the biological sex in the conversation. I guess that for me, it seems to be helpful. But trans woman, I think nobody knows quite what that means when you say it. And the other thing is there's probably 4 or 5 different reasons for transitioning. And of course, let's not go down that rabbit hole, but I mean, there's all kinds of different, motivations for being involved and for doing this. And I guess that's a side issue. I want to actually, if I may, I've been seeing some of the chat questions about peer review and whether the data that World Rugby used was actually accurate and valid and blah, blah, blah. You know what? That is absolutely a red herring, because we have had for all of sport history, male sport, female sport. If somebody wants to come from one category to the other, the onus is on them to prove that they belong. It's not, the onus isn't on women or our side to prove why a trans-identified male shouldn't be in our sport. The onus has to be on the people trying to come into the category. And as far as I'm concerned, the minimal and terrible research presented by Joanna Harper at the IOC level in order to get this first, let's face it, the World Rugby policy was based on the International Olympics policy, and that came into being on the basis of a study that followed only eight long distance runners who self-reported their running times from 20 years previously, before they transitioned, to 20 years afterwards. And then all kinds of assumptions were made to say that those guys, those males who had transitioned to females or to women, to the women's category, had reduced their performance to the expected amount, 10%. There is nothing peer review about that study, and yet the IOC changed its policies to allow males into women's sport on the basis of a flimsy 8-person self-reported time study. And they didn't even control very well for the age difference. So if you're a 20-year-old and you're running a certain marathon time as a 20-year-old, then you decide to transition when you're 40 or 50-year-old, you run another marathon and your time drops. That doesn't mean your time dropped because you transition. It means your time dropped because you're older. And that was not well controlled. So don't talk to me about peer review in terms of us having to prove why people can't come into our category. It has to be proven better on the other side of it.
Can I just add something to that? I'd like to just add something to that. Like, don't you think it's actually slightly absurd that we've got all these scientists beavering away for years trying to prove or disprove something that anyone with functioning eyes and the capacity for rectal thought has no interest in?
Absolutely. Yeah.
In addition, we've got hundreds of years of sporting competitions which have provided us with records that prove that males have a biological advantage over females. So, like peer-reviewed studies, all the rest, great, if they can bring them out, but hello, eyes, knowledge.
Yeah, exactly.
We have doctors in the United States working on trying to publish these peer-reviewed studies in our favor, and they are pretty much getting canceled, as we call it.
Yeah.
So, well said, ladies. I have a question for Jennifer. Someone was curious, they missed your statistics on how much money is spent in the trans industry in the medical field. Didn't you mention how much in a year or something like that gets spent?
On transgenderism?
Yeah.
No, I didn't have a statistic like that.
Or how much gets spent in the medical industry in a year?
Well, the healthcare industry globally annually is $3 trillion.
I think that's what they were looking for. Yeah, that's incredible.
Incredible.
I mean, if you live to be 1,000 and you started counting every single day, every single minute, you probably couldn't count that far.
I would like to hear maybe from Linda, Senator Claire. We have a question here. Somebody asking us, well, what about the athletes going on strike? Is that something that we're going to have to end up doing, do you think, Linda?
Well, I think, okay, the analogy I like to use is a thief is breaking into your house, and the way to handle that is to run out of the house and sit on the lawn and let them go in. Like, why? I mean, why would we sit down? These women have trained for 10 years to be at that moment in the Olympic Stadium on the track to run their race. And they're suddenly supposed to, after all that work, sit down on the starting line and not let them, not run the race if somebody's in that race. That's not up to the athletes. They've worked hard to be there. That's their moment. And I know, if it came to it, if it was, we were really pushed to the limit, maybe we could ask them to do that. They would come to that conclusion. But it's a little much to ask an athlete who has given up her whole life to somehow be the one to carry this on her shoulders and sit down instead of running her race.
Right.
I think, I think it's up to the leadership, and shame on the IOC for putting us in this position. It's up to us to do our best to convince them to rescind that policy that came into place in 2015, allowing people just simply self-ID with no surgery, very little hormonal change. I think it's up to the leadership class. And I just feel like it's a lot. I know it just makes sense. Like if this was a professional league of Olympic sports, if people were getting paid full time or something where they could, sit down today and compete again tomorrow. But that's not how it works. Sometimes it's their only chance at a medal or only chance at the Olympic Games. And they're somehow all of a sudden, after 10 years of training, 4 years of training, whatever, sit down and supposed to somehow make a statement. I think that's way too much to ask female athletes, and it shouldn't be up to them.
Yeah, you're totally right. Just like it should not be up to the athletes over in Connecticut, those young females, to take this on. Bless their hearts. They are the brave and courageous ones. Now it's our turn to step up and speak out. Does anyone else want to add on to what we were just talking about there?
I'd like to. I mean, I really think that, women are being put in a position to have to defend ourselves, and defend women's sports, when really we should be going on the offense, on the offense, and asking, where is this coming from? Why is this happening? Overexpression? People want to express themselves? Fine. There is no transgender. We have to deconstruct transgenderism. Okay, this is a construct. And we have to deconstruct it because female is being deconstructed. We are being literally erased in language, in law, in our sports, in our universities, everywhere. We are being erased. We have to go on the offense. We cannot continue to be in this position of defending. I mean, it's absurd. It's absurd that we're placed here. We have to go on the offense. We have to say, this is ridiculous. Why is this happening? Why are you doing this? For expression? No, that's not working for me. That's not working for me. And to what you said, Beth, yes, you're the one that are coming into our sports. You're the one that has to justify what you're doing here. What are you doing here? Why?
Mm-hmm.
Huh?
Yeah,
And Jennifer,
exactly.
for the 3-point shot at the end here.
Slam.
Does anybody else want to add on to that?
I want to have one more I'm sorry I talked too much, but I want to say one more thing. With in terms of leadership, because now I'm the president for another 2 years at the local level, provincial level. What I notice is you have the IOC at the very top making this policy decision. And then they trickle it down to the national policy, the federations, which is World Rugby does it, and then the local rugby people have to accept it or whatever. And then all of a sudden it goes down into the provincial levels, where we, my people, are the ones that actually run the sport at ground level. We are the actual, it's federal government, stateside, and then local, right? And the action happens on the ground in sport. So what they do is they hand this all down to us, and now we're the ones that's supposed to implement this thing, right? So I want anybody who's on this call to realize, if you lead a local team and you have the wherewithal to make a local policy that is within the law, but also stands your ground, do it, because you actually have the most power in sport to change what's really happening. And now, in our case, in Athletics Alberta, we say if you were born male, you compete with males irrespective, because it's not fair to women. If you're a female and you want to identify as into the men's, then we have to decide at what point your hormone replacement therapy sends you into doping, and then you have to go to the other side. So it's very simple and it's very fair. And you know what? As long as we hold our line, the national governing body can virtue signal all they want, but as long as we hold the line on the ground, they will never see somebody who's not in the right category. Because it goes up the line like that, right?
It's
So
all
they can
up to us.
Yeah, so they can afford to virtue signal all they want, but it's up to us to implement.
And it's going to be a grassroots effort, and we're doing it.
And so, in Canada, we have to be very careful because there are laws now. But as we've said a number of times, even with men and women's prisons, Bill C-16 said you can't discriminate on the basis of gender expression or gender identity, which of course Jordan Peterson was talking about. But that does not mean nobody told, let's say, a prison warden that means you must have put a male person in a female prison. There are other solutions to this. You can still respect their gender expression. You can still express their gender identity or recognize their gender identity, but maybe you need to put a wing on men's prisons instead of pushing them into the women's prison. So my point is, it doesn't mean that we have to jam male bodies into a female space. That's not what the law meant. Nobody said we had to do that. But we're trying to be, when our leaders in Canada gaslight local leaders like me to say, no, this is a law, you have to do it. And I say, well, wait a minute, that's an interpretation of the law, but that's not necessarily what we have to do.
Great. And if anyone in Canada wants to contact Linda, can we give them your Save Women's Sports email?
Yeah, absolutely.
Linda@savewomensports.com. Rally the troops in Canada there. Yeah. I have one that probably Senator Claire can help us with, and we can all add on. There's a lot of question over if World Rugby and other such heavy contact sports should have different rules than other sports, or if club level and elite level should have different rules.
On the contact versus non-contact, obviously the World Rugby research has focused on the risk of injury and the like, but digging deeper on some of the research, I think that the strength disparity question brings into play the whole fairness issue. So I'm not convinced that this is just a contact sport issue. I think the same research can be used to support the whole spectrum of sport, anywhere where, strength and stamina is relevant, because, fundamentally, it's not going to be fair for women competing. Athletics is an excellent example where we see this play out, that of course men run faster than women do. So I don't necessarily think it's a contact versus non-contact thing. And on elite versus community, the most visible place where I have at least heard of this issue playing out is at the community sports level, where parents don't want their daughters to be forced to play sport against biological boys or biological young men. So I absolutely think there needs to be consistency through all levels of sport, but it is difficult to push it down to that level. And I think Linda makes a really good point that starting at the grassroots and working your way up is probably even more powerful in this situation.
I think that was a great answer. We really need to protect it at all levels. If we don't protect our community level, it's going to stop the chain of progression. Young girls won't want to start training. There will be no reason to. And in the United States here, 95% of our female leaders have played sports. We can't cut off that connection. Mm-hmm. Does anyone else want to add on to this?
Yeah, I will. Just on the community game, like especially when we're talking about rugby, because I'm not sure how many of you have actually seen a game of rugby. It is a high contact sport. You know, these people who play put their bodies on the line the entire game. And when you've got guys, even if they're similar size guys playing similar size females, guys are, 40% stronger. You know, they've got 40% more muscle mass, 40% less body fat. They've got more explosion in their movement. So when they go into a tackle, even if it's two similar size people, that male has, there's a 20 to 30% chance of higher risk of injury for that female player, even playing a male of the same size. So it's really, really important that this comes right down to the community game too, because if we put girls off playing rugby, and it'll put parents off too, because in New Zealand, we already have a lot of parents who are nervous about their sons playing rugby. So if you put their daughters in a situation where they're potentially playing a biological male, they're going to be even less likely to let them play. So it's really important. This comes right back down to the community game as well. So we protect our female players and their pathways and opportunities to play the sport.
That's great. That's great. I have a question here. I'm not sure who will start. Maybe this one's aimed towards Linda, but it is a very good question from Candace Jackson. Should the eligibility rules be the same for trans-identified athletes as for people with DSDs, disorders of sexual development, i.e. intersex conditions? If a person was recorded at birth at female but learns during adolescence, etc., that they have XY chromosomes and internal testes but happen to have normal male levels of testosterone, should they play female sports? So this is basically referencing Caster. Linda, can you keep it short and get on this one?
Okay, so here's where we have to be very cautious, but one thing for sure, as anybody who watches, who follows Colin Wright and some of other experts in this area, the vast majority, 98% of human beings are either strictly male or strictly female, and there's a small percentage, even smaller than 2%, probably 0.02% in the population are called intersex, where they have ambiguous, maybe genitals and hormonal levels. But even in that group, you can almost always split that smaller ambiguous group into males with DSD, females with DSD. So even if you're a male with DSD, as is Caster Semenya, unfortunately, the Y chromosomes involved, hormones are involved that give that person an advantage. And unfortunately, if that is discovered, then that person is ineligible. I mean, it's not up to sport to really sort of try to sort of say, well, everybody has a right to be involved. I mean, we've all had a situation where even in high school, you tried out for the team, you didn't make the team. You wanted to be team captain, it didn't work. I wanted to go to the Olympic Games. I was already national champion, but somehow I didn't quite fit the qualifications for 1988, and I was left off the Olympic team. Everybody in sport knows that it's not your God-given human right to automatically be involved in sport all the time. Sometimes you have to qualify in a certain way. There are eligibility standards. Now,
Sports
the thing
are inherently discriminatory.
Right, because not everybody makes the team.
You have to do
and sometimes somebody applies or thinks they want to qualify, but they don't qualify. They're not eligible. Thank you very much. Thank you for trying. Now, next. But that's sports. And when I listen to Rachel McKinnon, for example, the cyclist, now Veronica Ivy, get interviewed, they literally state that part of their journey into women's sport is to use it as affirmation. Well, I'm sorry. Women's sport is not the venue for mental health or somehow an acceptance therapy. We care about you, but as a person and in society, you can identify any way you'd like, and we will respect you for that. But sport has eligibility standards. And I'm sorry, as much as we feel sorry for somebody, doesn't mean that person has a God-given right to be in this particular sport. That's sports. If you think otherwise, then you don't even know what sport is.
That's great.
Again, instead of defending women's sports, you know, against or because of intersex individuals, people with intersex conditions, you know, we should be asking why, what does this have to do with, you know, male and female sports? You know, why has this become an issue, right?
There are standards.
Why is this
There are
concept
standards.
an issue? Why is intersex? Intersex is a Trojan horse to deconstruct sexual dimorphism. They're using a disorder of sexual development to say that we are not a sexually dimorphic species, and we are.
We are.
And we should go on the offense. We should be talking about this out loud, straight up. No, you know, equivocation. You know, stop being polite. Stop being polite. They're erasing you.
I think that's how we've gotten somewhat this far is our niceness has been taken advantage of as women. Just and as people in general, we want to stay kind. We don't want to hurt
Absolutely.
people's feelings, but in essence, our rights shouldn't get trampled on in the meantime, right?
Sport is not the venue for psychosocial therapy. It's brutal. And I mean, whether you lose, it's not the place. If somebody needs somehow, I don't know, there are lots of outlets, recreational, you go and play ultimate frisbee in a community league. Be my guest. There's recreation opportunities everywhere.
Right.
You don't have to force your way into high-level sports.
That's great. I think this is a pretty good point to end. We've gone a little bit over time here. Do any of you wonderful women have any closing comments?
No, just keep up the great work, Beth. I mean, you are just
Beth.
an example. It's incredible what you're achieving. So yeah, kudos to you.
All,
Amazing.
and thank you to all the attendees. I hope you'll join in to our next few webinars. This is again the first of a 4-part series. Next week we will be talking about Idaho with Representative Barbara Eckhardt and lawyer from the ADF, Christiana Holcomb. It'll be very exciting. We've got some new merch in on Save Women's Sports, so you can send postcards to your representatives. We got buttons and patches. So just hit up savewomensports.com, check out all these other ladies' spots, and don't forget savewomensports.com/2-world-rugby. That's where our open letter is. We need you all to sign. We're going to be turning it in to World Rugby at the end of the week. Now is your time to speak up. Thank you all for joining me. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Beth. You're awesome.
Thanks so much, Beth.